So I've been shooting with the Sony A7CR for the past year now, and over the past year this has been my primary camera for photography. Now, just to give you a little bit of backstory, the original Sony A7C is why I fell back in love with photography. Now, before that camera came out, I was at a point in my photography career where I was feeling very uninspired and just bored of the photos I was taking. Now, I was primarily a portrait photographer, and then the pandemic happened, so I wasn't shooting as many portraits. And then in September 2020, the original Sony A7C was announced and released. And it reminded me a lot of my very first camera that I bought, which was the Sony A6000, the silver A6000 to be specific. So when I saw them announce the original A7C and it had the silver colorway, I knew I wanted that camera, and it was one of the best decisions that I ever made, because when I got that camera, just picking it up made me want to go out and take photos, and I think that's one of the most important aspects of a camera. So I loved using that camera for years, and it's the reason I even have this YouTube channel in the first place, because I wanted to share and make videos about a camera that I felt like no one else really made videos of, and it didn't really seem like anyone else appreciated. But thanks to this YouTube channel, I found an audience that also really loves the Sony A7C cameras. Now, all of my biggest gripes of the original Sony A7C were fixed when the Sony A7CR was announced. So I was very excited for this camera, but my biggest concern was whether this camera could recapture that same magic that the original Sony A7C did for me. Now, no camera is perfect, and the A7CR is definitely no exception. This camera is lacking a few important features that I know a lot of professional photographers want in a camera, mainly dual card slots, but also a joystick on the back. Personally, for me, not having those features isn't a big deal. Now, of course, it would be nice to have dual card slots, but I can live without it. I think the easiest solution, if the reason they're not putting dual card slots on this camera is because of the form factor and the overall size of this camera, I think it would be great if Sony introduced internal storage to their cameras, even if it's just 64 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes. And the lack of a joystick is not a big deal to me. I lived without it on the original Sony A7C, so I don't miss having one because I never had one on the first place on my camera. Now, personally for me, the features I was looking forward to the most was especially the 60 megapixel sensor. I used to own the Sony A7R II, and I really missed that high resolution sensor and the ability to crop in, and this has an even better sensor than that camera, so I was very excited for that. Now, regarding other features, the improved viewfinder was a huge plus. The original viewfinder on the Sony A7C, while I got used to it and it wasn't too much of a problem after a while, this viewfinder is so much better than the original Sony A7C. Now, my only complaint in that regard is the resolution of the viewfinder itself is not increased. The viewfinder, or the screen inside the viewfinder, has a higher magnification size, which gives the illusion that the viewfinder itself is bigger, but it's actually not. So if you had issues seeing through the original Sony A7C viewfinder, you might still have some issues with this one, especially if you wear glasses. Regarding other improvements, I really like the new grip on the Sony A7C II and the A7CR compared to the original Sony A7C. It's a slightly deeper grip, and it has a front dial on it, which allows you to control your aperture or your shutter speed or your ISO, whichever one you would like to use. Which leads into my next favorite thing about this camera. With the addition of that front dial, you can now control every aspect of your exposure with dials on the camera. So the exposure compensation dial on the top of the camera, you can now reprogram that to your ISO or your aperture or your shutter speed, depending on whatever your preference is. I personally have my aperture on the front, my shutter speed on the back, and my ISO on the top. So now I no longer have to go into the menu system or use the back wheel and rotate it to control every aspect of my exposure, and it's just a really nice quality of life upgrade. Now, moving on from the features and the upgrades of the Sony A7CR, I want to talk about the overall experience I've had using this camera so far. Now, it's no secret just by this video alone that I love using this camera, and the reason I think that is because it feels like the Sony A7C line of cameras is Sony's real first attempt at making a camera that is just fun to use, to me at least. Now, I think in recent years, Sony has built up a reputation of having the latest sensor technology and the most advanced autofocus. And in the process of becoming the most innovative camera manufacturer, they've also kind of become the most soulless. Meanwhile, we have camera manufacturers like Fujifilm creating cameras like the X100VI, Nikon with the ZF, and even Leica as well, creating cameras that are just simply fun to use and actually inspire you and make you want to go out and take photos. And if it weren't for the original Sony A7C and then them announcing the A7CR, I don't think I would still be shooting on Sony. Because this camera feels like Sony's best attempt at creating a camera, like I mentioned, that is just simply fun to use. By now, I would have probably just moved on to another camera brand that is creating cameras that are fun to use, but thankfully Sony is releasing these cameras, and it feels like Sony's best attempt at creating a camera that is just simply fun to pick up and go out and take photos. But that's exactly what this camera does for me, and that's why I love it so much. But I know this camera will not be meant for everyone. Because I know there are still probably plenty of people who will think this camera is soulless or it's missing this feature or that feature, but it's obvious that not every camera is meant for everyone. But I will say a camera this small and compact does not feel like it should take photos as good as it does, but it does. So I think all of us can agree that a majority of the time 60 megapixels is pretty overkill and not really necessary. So sometimes I just end up shooting in the medium lossless compressed RAW format, which is 26 megapixels. Which is also one of the reasons I chose this camera over the Sony A7C II, just having that flexibility on whether I want to shoot in that super high resolution or a more normal average resolution 26 megapixels compared to the 33 on the Sony A7C II. And plus, if you are using an APS-C lens on this camera, you are still getting 26 megapixels. So you basically have a built-in Sony A6700 in this camera. Now, also like I mentioned earlier, I am a huge fan of the silver model of the Sony A7C. I just think it looks really good. It has that amazing retro kind of aesthetic and look to it. I've had a lot of people mistake this camera for being a film camera, which I just find to be really funny. And it must mean Sony is doing something right, whether it was intentional or not. Now, that was only made better on the A7CR and the A7C II because SmallRig released this silver grip extension, which matches the top of the camera actually extremely well. Now, I enjoy using this grip a lot more than the grip extension that Sony included in the box. Personally, I'm just not a fan of that design. It doesn't look like it belongs on the Sony A7C, in my personal opinion. Now, it is really comfortable to use, but the functionality and the use of it just isn't there, especially when the SmallRig grip extension allows me to have just a little bit more pinky support. And it allows me to put this camera on a tripod super easily without having to use an adapter. And it also has a little slot where you can attach a sling in case you want to use your camera and mount the sling like this, like I personally prefer to. And not to mention, this grip is only $30 when the Sony grip is $160. So I would personally recommend that everyone go buy either this grip or another one of the SmallRig grips instead of the Sony grip, because that grip is definitely not worth $160, in my personal opinion. All right, I'm gonna start wrapping up this video, but I think I've talked enough about my favorite aspects of this camera, and I think it's time we talk about some of my least favorite aspects of this camera. And the first one being the flip out screen, which is pretty much standard on most cameras. But I really wish this camera had the flip out and tilt screen of the Sony A7R V, considering the fact that this camera is kind of a mini Sony A7R V. But I understand with the compact size, they had to cut some corners. But at the same time, I don't think it would have compromised on the compact size too much, at least, if they had been able to fit the flip out and tilt screen of that camera on this camera. Now, that's just one of my personal gripes. Personally, I don't really flip out the screen too terribly much, but when I am shooting any kind of street photography and I want to keep the camera kind of low, kind of not up to my eye, make it super obvious that I am taking photos, you normally want to stay pretty low key. Holding the camera like this, it also makes it pretty obvious that you are taking photos. Now, to me, that is just a minor annoyance. It's definitely not a deal breaker, but for me, my biggest annoyance with this camera is actually the shutter sound, ironically. Now, I will let you guys hear the normal shutter sound. All right, I think you guys could hear that. And it's a fake shutter sound. Now, of course, there's an actual shutter in this camera, but there's a fake like high-pitched shutter noise, which I just don't think it sounds very good. And I've seen a lot of people argue about this online and say it's not a fake shutter noise, but it is, because there are two speakers on the top of the camera right here, and if you cover them up, you will hear just the normal shutter. Now let me demonstrate this for you guys. So this is not covering it up with the artificial shutter sound. And this is when you cover up the speaker, and this is just the shutter. But you know, it is what it is, and it's not going to stop me from using this camera, obviously. It's just one of those little things that I wish Sony would have done differently, and hopefully they will make that change in the future and allow us to turn it off if they ever do make a Sony A7C III or A7CR II. And the final annoying aspect of this camera for me goes back to the APS-C mode in the viewfinder. When you are shooting in APS-C mode, it crops in the viewfinder itself, so you get a lower resolution image when you're looking through the viewfinder, and everything just kind of starts to look super pixely, which can make it very distracting when you're trying to take photos. Now, I wish there was a way that Sony was able to crop in on the sensor but not crop in the actual viewfinder and maintain the full resolution of the viewfinder when you are shooting in APS-C mode. But I don't know if there is some kind of software or hardware limitation there, because I feel like if it was possible, they probably would have done it already. Or maybe it was just an oversight because it's not a problem on the other Sony A7 bodies that do have a higher resolution viewfinder. So I was trying to think of other ways Sony could possibly work around this if it is some kind of software or hardware limitation. And the first thing that came to my mind was the Leica Q2 and the Q3. Now everyone knows that those cameras have a fixed prime lens, but Leica allows you to crop in and shoot at different focal lengths. And instead of actually cropping in the viewfinder, it kind of shows you frame lines like in an actual rangefinder film camera, which I think Sony could implement easily on this camera, and it would fix that problem. And it would also just kind of help make this camera feel even more like an actual rangefinder. And that is pretty much it for my complaints with this camera. The only other minor thing, which doesn't really affect me most of the time, is the fact that you can only go up to 1/4000th of a second shutter speed. You can't go to 8000th or higher, which can be pretty annoying if you're shooting wide open in the middle of the day, I guess. But I rarely ever do that, so obviously it's not a problem. All right, now regardless of those negative things I mentioned, it doesn't make me love this camera any less, or make me want to buy a different camera. I just love using this camera. So feel free to agree or disagree with me, because this camera might not do for you what it does for me. So I think when people bring up the topic of does camera gear matter, I don't think it's about the specs. I think the topic should actually be about, does this camera inspire me to actually go out and use it? Because if it doesn't, then you wasted your money and you're not gonna go out and use this camera to its fullest potential. All right, so I think I've covered pretty much everything that I can think of for the Sony A7CR, but if that's not enough for you, I do have plenty of videos on my channel going over what I think are the best settings and the best lenses for this camera. I also have plenty of videos of me just actually going out and shooting and using this camera. Those are my favorite videos to make, and I plan on making a lot more of them, especially this upcoming year. But in the meantime, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe to help support me. And I hope I could inspire you guys to get out and take more photos. Go out and shoot.